All stories have a beginning, a point at which a mere concept becomes a firm and tangible reality in the mind of an author, providing the catalyst for what is to come. While we have already covered the conclusion of the great tapestry which Tolkien wrought for us with our video on the War of the Ring, this video will detail the inception of his Middle-earth. The first age of Middle-earth was one of strife and heartbreak, yet also great beauty and joy, a paradox in and of itself, one which can be fully encapsulated within the microcosm of the Silmarils. For these jewels would cause mountains to be levelled, great battles to be waged, unparalleled heroism in the face of a foe of incomparable malice and wrath, yet most importantly of all, unnumbered tears were to be brought to the shores of Middle-earth in their name. It is in these uncompromisingly dark days that the names of Fëanor, Fingolfin, Maedhros, Hurin, and a myriad more were to be etched and engraved into the very cornerstone of Tolkien's mythos, and in so doing, forever alter the world which they fought for with such quiet desperation. In this video we will talk about the rise of Morgoth and how he dominated Beleriand. These long videos are extremely difficult to make, so consider liking, commenting, sharing and subscribing to help us in our struggle with the algorithm. We all know where this leads by the time of the Third Age, but now there's a new story in Middle-earth in which a new ring of power disrupts the flow of history. You'll find this tale in the Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth, the sponsor for this video. It's a game about collecting good and evil characters from across the timelines to use in battles, based not only on the existing canon, but on new Tolkien-inspired stories. After all, you possess a new ring of power that alters time, so you can intervene in iconic moments from Middle-earth's past. By bringing together characters and creatures from across Middle-earth, you can find synergies to overcome the various challenges you'll face throughout the campaign. On June 26th, the first legendary character will be added to the game, Elrond. To get him, first you need to unlock 5 elven characters. Then you can do the new legendary adventure to win Elrond to your side. Definitely worth it for his great healing and ability to summon Bruinen for a powerful multi-target attack with bonus damage against shadow units. You can get the game for free right now by using our link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen. Go prepare for the arrival of Elrond and plenty more legendary characters in the future in the Lord of the Rings Heroes of Middle-earth. Before the creation, there was Eru Iluvatar, father of all, wielder of the flame imperishable, and the supreme deity who subsequently saw fit to create the Ainur. The Ainur, or Holy Ones, were a group of primordial spirits, fashioned from the flame imperishable itself. The universe, Ea, and Arda, the world upon which the events of the Silmarillion take place, were created through the Ainulin Dali, or the music of Ainur, who were all in harmony, save for one of them, Melkor, who disrupted it with discordant tones. Upon the creation of Arda, the Ainur descended to the surface, deciding to live there as long as it should last, and 14 of the most powerful among them became the Valar, or the powers of the world. Melkor, who would become known as Morgoth, claimed lordship over Arda. The other Valar opted for Manwë, who despite not being as powerful as Melkor, understood the thoughts of Eru more than any other. Melkor turned away from such a path, becoming the first Dark Lord and forever altering the future of Arda. The remaining Ainur, who were lesser in power, were to become the Maiar following their descent. The Valar would then set about bettering the world they found themselves in. However, Melkor would continuously disrupt their efforts, as he had initially in disrupting their music. For a long time, Melkor set his might against that of the other Valar, and held the upper hand due to his immense strength, ensuring that Arda remained shapeless due to his destructive nature. That was of course until the mighty Tulkas made his way to Arda, and upon his descent, tipped the balance in favour of the Valar, forcing Melkor to flee from Arda for a time. This departure allowed the Valar to make something of the world in preparation for the coming of the Elves. They constructed 2 great lamps, Iluin the Silver Lamp to the north and Ormel the Golden Lamp to the south, which brought light to the world, setting their main place of dwelling within their light. This caused an explosion in biological life, which came to be known as the First Spring, but it was not to last. as Melkor returned to Arda along with a number of Maiar spirits who had attuned themselves to his music. Melkor then created a mighty fortress in the north, naming it Utumno, and to defend it, raised the Iron Mountains. Decay would begin to emerge from this portion of Arda, alerting the Valar. It was too late. Melkor emerged from Utumno, bringing and casting the lamps down. The fire contained within them burned through a vast portion of Arda, and in attempting to contain such wanton destruction, Melkor was allowed to flee north. Following this destruction, the Valar withdrew to the continent of Aman, and upon this land built Valinor, allowing Melkor to assume his reign over Middle-earth. In creating Valinor, the Vala Yavanna, the giver of fruits, sang into existence the two trees, Silver Telperion, considered to be male, and the Golden Laurelin, deemed female. They would provide the light the world now lacked, starting the years of the trees. Meanwhile, Melkor turned the once beautiful Middle-earth into a dark and cruel land filled with terrible creatures. He also built a lesser fortress to the west as a bulwark against the Valar, Angband. The Valar were unsure where the elves would awake, and remained unwilling to wage open war and risk them. As a result, Melkor sent spirits to assault the fledgling elves in the form of great horsemen, in order to cause them to fear the Valar Orome, Lord of the Forests, who would be the first to come upon them in his forays into Middle-earth. Melkor then began capturing the elves through his servants, corrupting them through torture and foul magic, crafting the first orcs, in mockery of the elves and Eru Ilúvatar. The remaining elves were aided by Orome, who quickly came to love them, and determined that he would not allow them to be consumed by Melkor's hatred. Melkor's ascendancy was challenged, as Valar Orome forced the other Valar into immediate action, and in the War of the Powers, the overwhelming force of the Valar devastated the enemy, forcing him to retreat to Utumno, and after a brutal siege, the Valar dragged Melkor from its darkness, bounding him with the great chain, the Agenor, which had been forged by the Valar Elui, the great smith of the Valar. Melkor was brought to Valinor, where he pleaded for clemency. This was granted, but he was to remain chained within the halls of Mandos for 3 ages. While this seemed to be the end of the matter, the Valar had failed to fully destroy Utumno, leaving many of its pits and vaults unexplored, and as a result, a corrupted Maiar, Sauron, remained at large. The Valar also didn't destroy the Balrogs, also known as the Valaraukar, who gathered at the ruined remnants of Angband and began a lengthy hibernation in preparation for the return of their Dark Lord. Orome returned to the elves to summon them to Aman to live in peace and harmony among the Valar. However, many of them feared the immense power which the Valar had unleashed in their war against Melkor, and they sent 3 representatives to inspect Aman. Ingwe, Finwë and Elwë returned, speaking of the glory and bliss of Valinor, and this began the Great Journey, which also came to be known as the Sundering of the Elves, as all of the elvish people agreed to join the Valar in Valinor, apart from the Avari, who chose to remain. Of the 3 main groups of elves who agreed to make their way to Valinor, the Vanyar and the Noldor were most eager, and reached the coast first, being taken to Valinor on an island of Tol Eressëa, with the Valar Ulmo guiding them across the Belagir, also known as the Sundering Sea. The Teleri, drawn to the forests and rivers of Middle-earth, were the slowest of the groups, allowing their curiosity to get the better of them. This caused them to separate into multiple splinter groups, such as the Nandor, who would go on to become the Wood Elves of Wilderland, and later that of Beleriand. Many of the Teleri who disliked the sea withdrew, settling in the wooded areas of Rhégion and Neldoreth that would later come to be known as the Doriath. The Teleri who were drawn most deeply to the sea settled the western shores, becoming the Falathrim, and would later be ruled by the elf Círdan, who would found the coastal cities of Elgarest and Brythombar. However, the majority of the Teleri would eventually leave Middle-earth and would go to the island Tol Eressëa, led by Olwe, who would become their king, as his brother Elwë never returned to Valinor. The 3 elven clans would develop their own differing and rich cultures, with Ingwe becoming the king of the Vanyar and Finwë of the Noldor. Following the end of his sentence, Melkor feigned repentance, and Manwë, incapable of comprehending his corruption, ordered his release. For a time, Melkor behaved once more as the true thought of Eru which he had initially been formed to represent. However, Tulkas and Ulmo, the Valar most associated with water, were slow to forgive and remained vigilant. In truth, his immense defeat at the hands of the Valar had roused even greater malice within Melkor, who sought to bring ruin to Aman. Gazing upon the paradise the elves now enjoyed, Melkor's greatest desire became the corruption of this race, and he found the Noldor the most willing to listen. Melkor spread lies among them, bringing the Valar, and particularly their reasoning for bringing the elves to Aman, to disrepute. He claimed the Valara neglected to inform the elves of the coming of the race of man, and a vast portion of the Noldor now believed that the Valar had stolen their birthright, Middle-earth, by bringing them to Aman to allow the men to inhabit those lands exclusively. The Noldor would begin to openly dissent against the Valar, with chief amongst these dissenters being Fëanor, the firstborn son of Finwë. Born in Valinor during the Years of the Trees, Fëanor drew so much strength from his mother Miriel that she voluntarily left her life to go to the halls of Mandos. After some time, his father Finwë would remarry an elvish woman, Indis, who bore him 4 further children, Fingolfin, Finarfin, Findis, and Irimi. Fëanor disliked his mother-in-law and wasn't fond of his half-siblings. He lived apart from them during this time as an apprentice to the master smith Martan, learning his craft at the feet of the Valar Orli himself. Martan taught him much of metallurgy, and he would soon marry his daughter, Nirnaeth, who bore him 7 sons. Fëanor spent the majority of his time either in solitude or among his children, who were completely loyal to him. He became restless, exploring the majority of Aman, and continuously crafting new and increasingly masterful works. The greatest achievement of Fëanor was the creation of 3 breathtaking gems, Silmarils. He captured the intermingled light of the 2 trees of Valinor and sealed it into 3 large diamond-like gems. Their beauty brought great praise to Fëanor, and he came to love these gems above all else, coveting them with immense greed, ignoring that the light which ensured their beauty was not of his own making. He would vainly put the jewels on display one day, before fearing for their welfare the next and guarding them from all but his closest family members. His greed and jealousy would eventually cause him to keep the jewels under lock and key at all times. In spite of his immense hatred and fear of Melkor, Fëanor became the loudest Noldor expressing discontent with the stewardship of the Valar, who were distracted by this young princeling, which allowed Melkor to continue his work in the background unperturbed. The Valar did not act immediately, as was their way, and were only roused to action when Fëanor threatened his brother Fingolfin with violence, causing them to summon the elf to the Ring of Doom to answer for his actions. Fëanor claimed that Melkor had convinced him that his half-brother sought to usurp his heirship to his father's position and to take from him the Silmarils. Tulkas immediately departed in search of his hated enemy, but Melkor could not be found. Although he was provoked by Melkor, Fëanor's actions and their consequences remained his own, and the Valar exiled him to Formenos in the hills to the north of Valinor, and he went away taking with him an immense treasure, including the Silmarils. In a show of support, Finwë renounced his kingship and joined his son in exile, refusing to take up the mantle of rulership again so long as Fëanor remained in exile. Sometime later, Melkor came to Formenos feigning friendship in an attempt to wrest from the elf his most prized possessions. Fëanor saw through this and refused the Dark Lord's platitudes, shutting the doors of Formenos. Fearing the ill portents of this visit, Finwë reported the incident to the Valar, who once again failed to catch Melkor. The latter fled, unwilling to face the might of his counterparts, before coming to Avatar and finding Ungoliant, a primordial the origin of which remains unknown, who took the shape of a spider of gigantic proportions. Melkor promised the great spider that he would finally satiate her unrelenting hunger and led her back to Valinor. 7 years after Fëanor's exile, the Valar decided to reconcile with the Noldor and announced a great feast to which the exile was also invited. During the feast, Fingolfin recognized the seniority of his brother before the gathered crowds, and Fëanor begrudgingly accepted his acknowledgement. Their father Finwë did not get to see this, as he had stayed at home, keeping to his promise to remain in Formenos until his son's exile was over. Unfortunately for the Valar, they had left the trees unguarded, allowing Melkor to use a great spear to pierce them. Ungoliant started feasting upon the sap which flowed from the foul gashes, drained the trees and poisoned them, causing them to wither and die, plunging Aman once more into darkness. The Valar, realizing that the only way to restore the two trees was through the Silmarils, asked for them from Fëanor, who refused to give them up of his own free will, stating that forcing his hand would make them no better than Melkor. This all-encompassing darkness caused fear and despair across Valinor, and in this confusion, Melkor slayed Finwë, stealing the Silmarils and Fëanor's other gems. However, the Silmarils were of immense purity, and they burned Melkor's hands with unimaginable agony. Still, he refused to release them, and was brutally burned. With the Valar chasing them, Melkor and Ungoliant fled north, cloaked by the unlight of the latter. Crossing the grinding ice of the Helcaraxi, they made their way to Middle-earth. Here they came to the region of Lammoth, and Melkor sought to abandon his companion. Ungoliant quickly saw through Melkor's ruse, demanding that he surrender the gems in order to satiate her hunger. However, the Valar refused, prompting Ungoliant to attack. Empowered from draining the two trees, she was able to weave her dark webbing around Melkor. The cries of pain and woe this drew from the Dark Lord awakened the Balrogs from their sleep in Angband's darkest depths. They swiftly came to their lord's aid, driving away the great spider, who fled before their might. Melkor, anticipating that his actions would not come without consequences, began to rebuild his fell fortress of Angband to stand before what was yet to come. Upon learning of what had transpired, Fëanor cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, or Black Foe of the World. Ignoring his exile, Fëanor, the now king of his people, returned the city of the Noldor to Tirion and gave a dark speech. "Fair shall the end be," he cried, "though long and hard shall be the road. Say farewell to bondage, but say farewell also to ease. Say farewell to the weak, say farewell to your treasures, more still shall we make. Journey light, but bring with you your swords, for we will go further than Tauros, endure longer than Tulkas. We will never turn back from pursuit. After Morgoth to the ends of the earth, war shall he have and hatred undying. But when we have conquered and have regained the Silmarils that he stole, then behold, we alone, shall be the lords of the unsullied light, and masters of the bliss and the beauty of Arda. No other race shall oust us." His rage blinded him, causing the new king to include many of the lies Morgoth had fed him, and simultaneously unfairly blaming much of his suffering upon the Valar. While this alone roused the anger of his people, what was to come next would forever alter the future of Arda. Fëanor swore an oath upon the name of Eru Ilúvatar himself. Be he foe or friend, be he foul or clean, brood of Morgoth or bright Valar, elder or Maiar or aftercomer, man yet unborn upon Middle-earth, neither law nor love nor league of swords, dread nor danger, not doom itself, shall defend him from Fëanor and Fëanor's kin. Whoso hideth or hoardeth, or in hand taketh, finding keepeth or afar casteth a Silmaril. This swear we all. Death we will deal him ere day's ending. Woe unto world's end. Our word hear thou, Eru All-Father. To the everlasting darkness doom us if our deed faileth. On the holy mountain herein witness, and our vow remember, Manwë and Vada. As the oath of Fëanor against him was being sworn, the newly renamed Morgoth set about strengthening his position by restoring his mighty fortress of Angband. Preparing for the expected backlash of the elves, Morgoth hastily rebuilt his armies, breeding a vast, innumerable horde of orcs and other foul denizens, while simultaneously mounting the Silmarils into his iron crown. Despite these preparations, the fury of Noldor would surprise even the fallen Valar. The oratory skills of Fëanor had swayed the majority of the elves gathered. However, it was not long before dissent broke out as to who should lead such a host to Middle-earth. Although Fëanor was technically the High King, many Noldor disliked him, and his younger half-brother Fingolfin was seen as a greater unifying force, due to the love which the vast majority of the Noldor bore him. Fingolfin was not eager to embark on an expedition, but he had already sworn an oath to uphold his brother's rights as the eldest, and also feared that Fëanor's rash and selfish actions would lead his people to a disaster. At the same time, his son Fingon had been utterly swayed by Fëanor, and urged his father to join the expedition. So they set out, with Fëanor leading the first host, Fingolfin marching at the head of a second, larger host, and Finarfin commanding the third, much smaller and more reluctant group. Every 10th Noldor decided to stay in Tirion, either for the love of their home or the love of the Valar. Fëanor just now realized that he had no way of transporting his army. Middle-earth and Aman were at this point connected by Helcaraxe, a region which was immensely treacherous and bitterly cold even for the resilient elves at the height of their power, and the shifting ice was deemed to be impassable for a force this size. Thoughts then turned to the construction of a mighty fleet to ferry the Noldor. However, there were no shipwrights among them, and even if this had not been the case, the construction process would have given Morgoth too long to prepare for their coming. Fëanor instead made his way to the home of the seafaring Teleri, Alqualondë. The Teleri didn't want to leave Aman, as they prized these finely wrought white vessels above all else. Fëanor lectured the Teleri that they owed the Noldor for instructing them in the correct manner to construct buildings and cities. But the lord of the Teleri, Olwe, would not be swayed, and urged Fëanor to remain in Aman. A furious Fëanor refused to accept this, and understanding that much of the Noldor had been easily manipulated by his oratory, he once again made use of his charismatic presence, and convinced the host to aid him in taking the ships by force. The Teleri resisted, putting up a staunch defense of their home, throwing many of the Noldor into the sea, and driving back the far more heavily armed host 3 times. It is at this point the less impassioned second host, led by Fingolfin, came upon the battle as it continued to rage before Alqualondë. Believing the Teleri were the aggressors, his larger force joined the fray, allowing the ships to be wrested from their owners' control. Many of the mariners were slaughtered. A Maiar of the Inner Seas, Ossi, associated with the Lord of Waters, Valar Umo, was deeply outraged due to his love of the Teleri. Although he was prevented from intervening directly in the battle, Ossi summoned terrible storms in retribution, causing many Noldor casualties. This divine retribution was furthered by the emergence of a figure which is believed to have been Mandos himself, who uttered the words that would later be known as the Doom of Mandos in response to the First Kinslaying. "Tears unnumbered ye shall shed, and the Valar will fence Valinor against you, and shut you out, so that not even the echo of your lamentation shall pass over the mountains. On the house of Fëanor the wrath of the Valar lieth from the west unto the uttermost east, and upon all that will follow them it shall be laid also. Their oath shall drive them, and yet betray them, and ever snatch away the very treasures that they have sworn to pursue. To evil end shall all things turn that they begin well, and by treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason, shall this come to pass. The dispossessed shall be they forever." This exiled the Noldor from Valinor, and placed a curse upon them that the war against Morgoth would bring nothing but misery to their people. The Noldor were now utterly forsaken, and would no longer receive either welcome or aid from Valinor. Fëanor and his house were cursed, with Mandos foretelling a great degree of suffering and hardship to be their lot, in no small part due to the oath sworn to regain the Silmarils at any cost. The figure also made it clear to all gathered there that the war against Morgoth was to be hopeless, as the combatants, being merely elves, could not hope to overcome a Valar. Listening to the doom of his people, a heartbroken Finarfin, who had not participated in the kinslaying, turned his host back to cursing Fëanor. This smaller host was pardoned by the Valar, with Finarfin now serving as the High King of the Noldor in Tirion. Meanwhile, Morgoth made his first move in what came to be known as the First Battle of Beleriand, wherein the Sindarin Elves, who had not travelled to Valinor, had to fight the forces of Morgoth while the Noldor still remained in Aman. Morgoth sent forth 2 great armies to seize the southern territories of the Sindarin Elves. These hosts passed through the Vale of Sirion and east between Aros and Gelion. King Thingol of Doriath maintained a well-armed force, having defended Beleriand from countless horrors coming from the north. But despite his preparations, he faced a number of setbacks. The western host of orcs plundered much of West Beleriand, ravaging the countryside, and Lord Círdan of the Havens of Fallis marched out to meet them but was soundly defeated. He was then forced to retreat behind the walls of Eglarest and Brythombar, which were besieged, effectively cutting Thingol off from his allies in the west. Detachments from both of Morgoth's armies then entered Thingol's territory, but the elven defences held here. The King of Doriath's main focus was placed upon the bulk of the Orcish forces, which were assaulting his ally King Denethor of the Lyquendi, who was hard-pressed to hold them at bay. Denethor had answered Thingol's call to arms, but his people were lightly armed and no match for the arms and armour of Angband. The Lyquendi were soon pushed back to the Amon Ereb, where they were to make their last stand against a swirling sea of vicious orcs. They gave a good account of themselves, but were slain to an elf before they could be relieved. When Thingol's forces arrived, they were so enraged by the destruction of their allies that the orcs stood no chance against their might, and they were slaughtered, with only a small number surviving, only to be slain by the dwarves of Mount Dolmed. Although this was nominally a victory, the Havens remained under siege, and Thingol summoned all the Sindar who wished to live in peace to the forests of Rhegion and Neldoreth. Thingol's wife, Maiar Melian, had some power, and she used her magic. Hereafter, the lands of Thingol became enclosed under her protection by the magical barrier which came to be known as the Girdle of Melian, in a land forever after known as Doriath. With no aid forthcoming, the Havens remained under siege, and with the Lyquendi king dead, the remainder of his people returned to their forests in Osiriand, pledging to live in secrecy, distrusting outsiders and never naming another king, while some would go to Doriath, merging with the elves residing there. Meanwhile, Fëanor had defied the doom of his people and continued onwards, heading northwards. The temperatures dropped off steeply, and the skies continued to darken, indicating that they were now approaching Helcaraxë. At this point, many of the already reluctant Noldor began to express their discontent. Ossë's storms had destroyed much of the fleet, and there were no longer enough ships to bring all of the Noldor to Middle-earth at once. The doom of Mandos still hung over them, and none among them wished to be left on Aman while the rest crossed. Fëanor noticed this bubbling discontent, as well as the logistical issues which now plagued his mighty force, so he took counsel with the only elves he truly trusted at this point, his sons. Those loyal to Fëanor still maintained control of the remaining fleet. Therefore, as the dissension continued to grow, the High King simply left all those whose loyalty to him was not absolute in Aman, slipping away quietly one night with the ships. This force arrived at Loscar, in a land known as Lammoth, to the far west of Beleriand. Upon their arrival, Fëanor's eldest son, Maedhros, asked who was to bring the ships back to ferry the remainder of their people. In response, his father cruelly decided to burn the ships and abandon the rest of his kinsmen. Maedhros was not happy with this course of action, but refused to speak up to his father. He stood stoically gazing upon the burning fleet. The world at this point was still flat, and as such, Fingolfin's host could see the flames in the distance, making them aware of the treachery of their kin. The choice was presented to them to either return to Tirion in disgrace, or make the treacherous crossing over the Helcaraxë. They decided upon the latter in order to give them the opportunity to confront the errant Fëanor. A further contributing factor to this decision was the unwitting participation of Fingolfin's warriors in the Kinslaying. They remained unsure as to how they would be judged should they return to the Valar. This brutal journey across the grinding ice sheets was a lengthy and costly affair that took the lives of many of the Noldor, increasing their animosity towards their supposed High King and his followers. With the arrival of the Noldor to Beleriand, the War of the Jewels began, with the first battle coming as a preemptive strike on the part of the Dark Lord. He became aware of the coming of Fëanor and his host. The gates of Angband were swung open and a vast horde of the foul denizens of the Dark emerged, with Morgoth's orders to assault the elves before they could attain a proper foothold and erect effective defences. This battle came to be known as the Battle Under the Stars, or Dagor-nuin-Giliath, as the sun and the moon had not yet been created. The battle started when the Noldor arrived unexpectedly at the Firth of Drengist, passing through the gate of the Noldor into Hithlum and encamping upon the northern shore of Lake Mithrim. Although the Orcish horde far outnumbered the elves, the Noldor were still empowered by the light of Valinor and easily beat them back, leading to a hasty retreat. The ever-rash Fëanor was not happy with such a victory, and led his host in hot pursuit of the Orcs, who retreated north through Ardgallen. In an attempt to take the vengeful Fëanor by surprise, Morgoth's forces, which had been besieging the havens of Fallis since the First Battle of Beleriand, marched north to attack the Noldor from the rear. However, a force led by Fëanor's third son, Celegorm the Fair, intercepted and ambushed them at Eithel-Sirion, trapping the Orcs between two Noldorin hosts. The Orcs fought with all the vicious brutality of an entrapped rodent for 10 days, while encircled at the fens of Serek, but they could not hope to match the gleaming host of elves that descended upon them. The Orcs were slain, until only a minuscule group of them persisted and fled, and the reckless Fëanor, whose wrath reached its zenith at this point, pursued even this small group. His anger overrode his wisdom, and in his attempt to catch the remnants of Morgoth's army, he passed too far from the main portion of his own force, and seeing this, the Orcs turned and faced the High King of the Noldor at the very edge of Dor Daidalos. With the proximity of the field of battle to Angband, the Orcs were soon reinforced by a group of Balrogs, who quickly slew the elves who stood with their High King. Despite his faults, Fëanor embodied much of the power and glory which defined his race, and stood alone against the very greatest of the Dark Lord's servants, refusing to bend or break in spite of their fell power. While his struggle was heroic in every sense of the word, it remained doomed, as he took many wounds yet continued onward undaunted. Fëanor's ferocity required the very lord of the Balrogs, and the strongest of its kind to ever walk the lands of Middle-earth, Gothmog, to mortally wound the High King. Just as this fiery beast looked set to slay Fëanor, his sons came to his aid, driving off the Balrogs and Orcs, rescuing their father. They hurried from the battlefield, carrying their father to safety. However, Fëanor asked them to stop, knowing that the wounds he had sustained would take his life. Looking upon Angband, he cursed Morgoth thrice, but his defiance would die with him, as when gazing upon the immensity of the fortress, he finally realized the truth of Mandos's words, that the Noldor alone could not overthrow the Dark Lord. Still, he instructed his sons to maintain their oaths and avenge him. As he passed on, the fiery spirit which had so defined him left his body, burning it to ash. Immediately after this skirmish ended, the moon rose, and with the rising of such light among the skies came Fingolfin and his second, even larger force of Noldor, arriving in Lammoth. Here they were attacked by a large force of Orcs, which had initially been sent by Morgoth to attack Fëanor's host from the rear, in what came to be known as the Battle of Lammoth. Fingolfin was caught unawares by this ambush, and before he managed to drive off the Dark Lord's force, his son Argon was slain, sparing the Noldor to pursue the Orcs and completely destroy them. It was not long after the Dagor-nuin-Giliath and Fëanor's passing that an envoy from the Dark Lord came to the elves acknowledging defeat. This envoy offered terms that included the possible return of a Silmaril. Maedhros was cautious in going out to meet this embassy though, and brought with him more troops than was deemed necessary. His caution was well founded, but his preparations proved to be inadequate, as Morgoth had also expected treachery and sent a greater force, including a number of Balrogs. When the two groups met, the elves were slain en masse, despite fighting valiantly, and Maedhros was captured. Morgoth quickly sent word to the Noldor that if they were to forswear their oath and turn aside from the path of vengeance, Maedhros would be released unharmed. The elves were not so easily fooled, however, and sent no answer, knowing Maedhros would never be released in spite of their actions. Morgoth's response was a brutal one, much in keeping with his nature. Maedhros was hung from the face of a precipice of Thangorodrim by the wrist of his right hand, using a band forged from unbreakable steel, and was forced to hang from this steep point in immense pain while he gazed upon the plains where his people were unable to come to his aid due to the impenetrable fortifications the Dark Lord had erected. A further complication, and what would ultimately prove to be Maedhros' salvation, came in the guise of the internal divisions of the Noldor. Following their victory at the Battle of Lammoth, Fingolfin chased down the surviving orcs, who had caused the death of his youngest child. They chased them to the very fortress of Angband. However, the forces of the Dark Lord did not come out to meet the elvish threat. This was not due to the threat posed by Fingolfin's host, but rather the first rising of the sun, as this creation of the Valar Aului forced the servants of Morgoth to cower within the halls and dungeons of Angband. While this was viewed as the triumph of elven valor over the deafening darkness of Morgoth, none among the elvish peoples could be truly aware of what this rising was to symbolize. A chronicler writes, "And Anar the Fire Golden, fruit of Lorellin, they named the sun. But the Noldor named it Vasa, the heart of fire, that awakens and consumes, for the sun was set as a sign of the awakening of men and the waning of the elves." Still, the coming of the sun and the moon meant that the First Age had begun. Fingolfin then led his host to the northern shores of Lake Mithrim, where they came into contact with the Fëanorian element of Noldor, whom they had not seen since their great betrayal. Tensions between the two factions threatened to lead them into a civil war, were it not for the heroic actions of the son of Fingolfin, Fingon. Maedhros was the cousin of Fingon and a great friend of his, in spite of the animosity between the two factions. Hearing of his dear cousin's imprisonment, Fingon endeavoured to rescue him from the immense suffering of his captivity. Oddly enough, he was aided in this endeavour by Morgoth himself. In response to the emergence of the sun and the moon, Morgoth was left with little option but to blanket the skies around Angband with an almost impenetrable set of clouds, formed primarily of ash and smoke, in order to shield his servants from the damage which the light could cause them. Still, the servants of the Dark Lord displayed their inherent cowardice by refusing to leave Angband, as they were still left in fear of the newly emerged lights. So the valiant Fingon approached Angband, aided by the darkness of the ash clouds, with the cowardly orcs allowing him to reach Thangorodrim without encountering any resistance. However, as Angband remained virtually impenetrable, Fingon instead decided to sing a song of defiance, refusing to give in to the despair Morgoth had hoped to instill in all who came to gaze upon his abode. This proved fortuitous, as Maedhros, hearing the song, joined in, allowing Fingon to locate his cousin. However, when he neared his friend, Fingon realized that he could not save him. Unwilling to continue to live in perpetual despair and anguish through his imprisonment, Maedhros begged Fingon to shoot him. Though it broke his heart to consider the loss of his friend, Fingon acquiesced to the request. However, before he loosed the arrow, he prayed to Manwë to grant the arrow speed in order to reduce Maedhros' suffering. This prayer and plea for mercy was heard by Thorondor, the king of the Eagles, who prevented Fingon from engaging in yet another kinslaying before flying him up to Maedhros' side. Here, a further terrible realization that the band could not be broken led Maedhros to once more beg for death. Instead, Fingon severed his friend's hand, allowing them to escape on the back of Thorondor, who returned them to their kin. Here, the true courage and compassion displayed by this son of Fingolfin stayed the impending disaster of civil war. Maedhros recovered from his wound swiftly, and in gratitude for the rescue, and as an attempt of sorts to atone for his father's betrayal, Maedhros relinquished all claim to the High Kingship, making his uncle Fingolfin the High King of the Noldor, an act his brothers were in no way happy about. Seeing that this may cause issues down the line, Maedhros moved the more prone to anger and rash decision-making of his brothers to an area around the Hill of Hammering, where he would rule what would come to be known as the March of Maedhros. Despite his miraculous recovery, Maedhros never forgot nor forgave the suffering which was wrought upon him, and this drove him to become an even greater and more deadly swordsman with his left hand than he had ever been with his right. Furthermore, upon his lands he raised an imposing fortress, with the dual purpose of separating his fiery brothers from the people of Fingolfin, and also because he wished any attack from Angband to fall upon him first, so he may avenge his ill treatment at the hands of the Dark Lord. Meanwhile, under the capable stewardship of Fingolfin, who became the first High King of the Noldor in the 7th year of the First Age, many mighty kingdoms were established in Beleriand, which would prove to be a match for the continued assaults of Morgoth. The next such great test for the Elvish race came in the Dagor Aglareb, which was the third great battle fought in the First Age. While Morgoth's legions were initially terrified by the emergence of the sun and the moon, they soon overcame this fear. The Iron Mountains would spew forth flame as Morgoth sent forward many smaller groups of orcs, who first made their way through to the pass of Sirion and then to Maglor's Gap. They would fight a number of minor skirmishes along the way, as they penetrated deeply into the areas of East and West Beleriand. They were ultimately destroyed by the southern Noldor forces in conjunction with the elves, who were led by Círdan of the Phallus. However, this was naught more than an ill portent of what was yet to come. The elves, though immensely powerful, were far from a unified front outside of the Noldor. Doriath remained protected and as such shut away from the wider world, with its people unwilling to fight. The Lyquendi of Aseriand also refused to fight any further battles after the loss of their leader Denethor in the First Battle of Beleriand. In the 60th year of the First Age, the main force of orcs sallied forth from Angband. Immense in size, it spilled forth into Dothonion, where the twin sons of Finarfin, Angrod and Aegnor, barely held them at bay. The time they bought preventing the innumerable hordes of orcs from sweeping over the highlands of Dothonion proved pivotal, and gave enough time for Fingolfin and Maedhros to rally their respective forces in what would be a devastating counterattack. They met the legions of Morgoth on the plains of Lothlan and Ardgalan, trapping the orcs between them in a hammer and anvil type affair. This envelopment left the orcs hopelessly outmaneuvered, with Fingolfin coming from the west and Maedhros coming from the east. The majority of Morgoth's host was slaughtered wholesale, with some orcs attempting to break out and escape towards the safety of Angband. The elves, still furious from the pillaging of their lands by the orcish raiding parties, pursued them all the way to the fortress, and in sight of the gates of Angband, cut each and every orc down without mercy. Dagor Aglareb, which can be translated as the Glorious Battle from Elvish, represented the first ever complete victory of the elves over the machinations of the Dark Lord, and is seen as the starting point of the watchful peace which would come to be known as the Siege of Angband. Siege is however a misnomer, as it was a 400-year-long Noldor blockade of Angband. The elves were unable to actually assault the fortress due to its immense size and fortifications, and instead merely battled any parties of orcs that attempted to sally out in the intervening period, as the encirclement was still incomplete. Still, the elves were strong, and the impact of these small sorties was considered negligible by them. This would ultimately prove to be their undoing, as the forces of Morgoth, which emerged from the impassable north flank of the fortress, which was near the unguarded Iron Mountains, were able to take prisoners. Morgoth could then coerce these prisoners and bring them to his side, a fact the Noldor remained ignorant of. Fingolfin considered taking direct action against the fortress. However, he underestimated the true power of Morgoth and never earnestly engaged in such a strike, preferring to watch the realms of the elves flourish under the long peace. The majority of elves did not wish to engage in such action either, believing the cost in the lives of their people to be too great. Unbeknownst to them, they did not even possess the strength to overthrow Angband. According to the author, for the Noldor did not yet comprehend the fullness of the power of Morgoth, nor understand that their unaided war upon him was without final hope, whether they hasted or delayed. While this point in the First Age represented the great epoch of the strength of the elves, the rising of the sun and moon in the sky symbolized that their time as a dominant race, even at this point, would eventually be eclipsed. The elves were not the only creations of Eru who stood against Morgoth, and the dwarves aided them in the costly First Battle of Beleriand. They forged great alliances with the elves, with both peoples prospering from the trade which ensued, allowing the creation of great halls and masterful pieces of metalwork, including the invention of the famous dwarf mail and the finest steel the still young world had ever bore witness to. The most prominent of these holds were Belegost and Nogrod in the Blue Mountains, and the great halls of Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains. Even more consequential in the battles to come, however, was the emergence of the race of Man, or the Edain, in Hildorian, following the first rising of the sun. Unfortunately, Morgoth acted quickly, corrupting many of these early men prior to their migration. This migration involved the separation of the first men into two hosts, one which went north, reaching the Sea of Rhûn, with the second group moving southwest. This northern host endured a further schism, with the lesser folk dwelling in the hills to the southwest of the sea, and the greater folk living in the woods on the northeastern shores. Meanwhile, the southern group began to speak an entirely different language, and were joined by strange peoples, whom they referred to as Drúg. After a period of time, the lesser and greater folk resumed their migration, crossing Rhovanion, while the southern host of men reached the White Mountains. During the crossing of Eriador, the greater folk acted as the vanguard. However, they would eventually be surpassed by the lesser folk, who under the leadership of Balan were the first to cross the Blue Mountains and reach Beleriand. The following year, the southern tribe, led by Haldad, crossed the Blue Mountains and was followed by the greater folk, led by Marak. Initially, these peoples settled in Estolad, within the lands of Amrod and Amras, with many befriending the elves living in Beleriand and entering their service in return for land and title. In this way, it came to pass that the Edain dwelt in the lands of the Eldar, some here, some there, some wandering, some settled in kindreds or small peoples, and the most part of them soon learned the Grey Elven tongue, both as a common speech among themselves and because they were eager to learn the lore of the elves. But after a time, the elf kings, seeing that it was not good for elves and men to dwell mingled together without order, and that men needed lords of their own kind, set regions apart where men could live their own lives, and appointed chieftains to hold these lands freely. They were the allies of the Eldar in war, but marched under their own leaders. Yet many of the Edain had delight in the friendship of the elves, and dwelt among them for so long as they had leave, and the young men often took service for a time in the hosts of the kings. It is at this time that the divisions between the race of man were firmly established, leading to the creation of three houses of man. Firstly, the House of Beor, who were dark-haired and of stout build, resembling the Noldor above all the other races of elves. They were initially discovered by the son of Finarfin and the lord of Nargothrond, Finrod Felagund, who brought them to the lands of the Noldor lord Amrod. They would remain fiercely loyal to the House of Finarfin, and later took up residence in the lands of Dorthonion. The second house of the Edain would come to be known as the Haladin, or House of Haleth. They were dark-haired, but of slighter and smaller build than the first house, and were immensely reclusive in nature. As a result, they preferred to stay separate from the other men, and would be granted permission to settle in the forest of Brethil in Doriath, and preferred to generally stay out of wars. The final house was initially known as the House of Marak due to their leader of the same name. However, it would later come to be known as the House of Hador, after one of the greatest of the elf friends among their number. The Hador were the tallest of the three houses, and sported golden hair resembling the Vanyar elves. They were an extremely numerous tribe of a warlike nature, which caused the Green Elves of Assyrians to fear them. They first settled in Estelad before migrating to the Ered Wethrin, or Mountain of Shadows, and finally making their home in Dor Lormin. Their loyalty lay with the High King himself, Fingolfin. While at first, the peace provided by the siege allowed the elves and the Edain to grow ever closer, the seeds of Morgoth's taint and corruption were already being sown by his servants. To corrupt or destroy whatever so arose new and fair was ever the chief desire of Morgoth, and doubtless he had this purpose also in his errand, by fear and lies to make men the foes of the Eldar and bring them up out of the east against Beleriand. The weakness of men to stand before this corruption and remain unaltered by its malice and hatred would ultimately prove the undoing not only of the siege, but also the last great time of peace to be enjoyed by the elves of Middle-earth within Beleriand. The Noldor defences had held against all assaults the Dark Lord had sent their way following their great victory in the Dagor Aglareb. This forced Morgoth to change tact, as he had realised orcs alone were no match for the besiegers. Instead, he relied on spies to decide his next significant foray into Beleriand. The superiority of the elves at this time was evidenced by the green grass which had begun to grow even at the gates of Angband. This was purely symbolic, as Morgoth had bred an innumerable force of orcs and other fell beasts within the expanse of Angband. Still, something greater than orcs would be required to take on the elves, and Morgoth created the first dragon. The Noldor, unaware of the creation of a beast of such unprecedented power, had even considered launching an assault upon the gates of Angband. Yet despite the best plans of Fingolfin, the doom of Mandos still hung over the Noldor, and even at the height of their powers, such a victory lay beyond their grasp. While nearly all of the elven lords had rejected this plan due to the immense losses that would be incurred, they remained unaware of the futility of their continued struggle, even when their position was at its most secure. Morgoth had been aware of his strengths, yet he arrogantly underestimated the combined power of men and elves, which prompted him to assault the alliance before he had amassed enough force to destroy the Free Peoples. The Dagor Bragollach was to begin upon a bitterly cold night, in the middle of winter of the year 455 of the First Age. At this point in the 4 centuries-long siege, the elves had become laxer in their vigilance, which was to prove nigh on catastrophic for their people. On a night in which the watch was particularly lax, in no small part due to the fierce intensity of the cold, Thangorodrim and the Iron Mountains loosed a flood of flame and noxious gases. The green grass which had grown over the past 400 years across Ardgallen was consumed, to be replaced by a vast sweeping desert, which was renamed Anfauglith, the gasping dust. There came a time of winter, when night was dark and without moon, and the wide plain of Ardgallen stretched dim beneath the cold stars, from the hill forts of the Noldor to the feet of Thangorodrim. The watchfires burned low, and the guards were few. On the plain, few were waking in the camps of the horsemen of Hithlum. Then, suddenly, Morgoth sent forth great rivers of flame that ran down swifter than Balrogs from Thangorodrim, and poured all over the plain, and the mountains of iron belched forth fires of many poisonous hues, and the fume of them stank upon the air and was deadly. Thus Ardgallen perished. Many of the elves were killed immediately by this unprecedented attack, while the survivors fled. The elven horsemen rode south desperately to warn their brethren of what came in their wake. Their primary consideration, however, was merely survival. The legions of Morgoth followed the fires, and their composition primarily consisted of orcs, of such numbers the elves had never before witnessed, supplemented with Balrogs and Glaurung, the father of dragons, the most brutal of the Dark Lord's servants. Morgoth's strategy was simple, yet exceedingly deadly, even in the face of the formidable defences the elves had erected during the Great Peace. The haste of the advance was so great that the ring of fortifications, which consisted of the individual elven kingdoms, was isolated and forced to fight alone. Though many would have despaired in the face of such darkness, the elves and their Edain allies steeled themselves for the fight to come, with only valour to provide solace. Despite their bravery, the highlands of Dothonion were overrun in short order. The Free Peoples made the orcs pay for every inch of land they took. According to our chronicler, the sons of Finarfin bore most heavily the brunt of the assault, and Angrod and Egnor were slain. Beside them fell Bregolas, lord of the House of Beor, and a great part of the warriors of that people. Upon the plain of Lothland, many of Maglor's horsemen were burnt to a crisp by the intense flames of the Father of Dragons. Now practically undefended, Maglor's Gap was taken by the legions of orcs who followed Glaurung. This gave the Dark Lord passage to Beleriand. Maglor took with him what warriors had survived the onslaught and retreated to Himring, where they provided vital assistance to Maedhros. The fortress, supplemented by the bright blades and the ash-stained hauberks of Maglor's riders, withstood the onslaught. Maedhros hefted his blade in his only hand, cutting a bloody swath through the legions of the Dark Lord wherever it was required of him. The situation remained desperate on all fronts, however. The ferocity of the sons of Fëanor, Celegorm and Curufin alone could not hold the pass of Aglon, and they were forced to retreat in the face of the Black Legions of Morgoth. With the sons of the greatest scion of the Elvish race unable to stand in their way, the orcs streamed through Mount Rerir and moved into East Beleriand. They eventually despoiled the landscape and slaughtered the Elves and Edain who resided there. Glaurung then polluted and defiled Lake Hellavon, permanently marring its beauty. Caranthir, the darkest and most brutal of the sons of Fëanor, realized the futility of the defense of his position and retreated back to the hill of Amon Ereb. There, he and Amrod, Fëanor's youngest son, had constructed formidable defenses to be used as the bedrock of the counter-offensive to come. This counterattack allowed for a methodical and slow-paced approach to reclaim the despoiled lands of eastern Beleriand, and was only made possible through the courage displayed by Maglor and Maedhros to the north. Here the Dark Lord's forces broke as a wave upon a cliff-top, the brothers unwilling to bend or break before this tide, allowing their kinsmen the breathing room necessary to either hold or break forward. The ferocity of Maedhros in those days was unmatched, allowing him to initiate his counter-offensive, and he reclaimed the pass of Aglon as a result. This action plugged a glaring gap in the Elvish lines, which effectively denied the denizens of the Dark entrance into Beleriand through this avenue. In the western reaches of the Elvish lines, Minas Tirith's proud and stoutly built watchtower stood its silent vigil upon the pass of Sirion. King Finrod Felagund built this tower, and its command lay with Orodreth, son of Finathin. Having been made aware of the breaking of the Siege of Angband, Finrod hastily amassed a mighty host and marched to reinforce the pass. The king was caught unawares by an innumerable orcish rabble and ambushed at the marshy fens of Serek, where the orcs inflicted a heavy toll upon the elves, which effectively avenged the brutal destruction of their ancestors during the Dagor-nuin-Giliath. The numbers of orcs were so great that the king himself was almost slain, if not for the timely intervention of King Barahir and the men of Dorthonion. Barahir had become aware of the plight of his elvish allies and descended upon the orcs, reaping a brutal harvest of black blood and misshapen bodies, which allowed him to rescue the king. Finrod, who had barely escaped with his life, owed a debt of gratitude to this man of the House of Beor, one which he could never truly repay. Yet as a form of immediate compensation for the bravery of the Edain, Finrod bestowed upon Barahir one of his rings. This would eventually become known as the Ring of Barahir, and was passed down through generations of man, eventually reaching a certain Aragorn, son of Arathorn, the future King Elessar. In conjunction with the ring, Finrod also swore a solemn oath on that bloody day that he would answer if Barahir or his kin called for aid. After this exchange, Finrod led what remained of his host and people south to Nargothrond. Barahir would not so quickly leave his home to the vile machinations of the servants of Morgoth. This great king of the Edain fought with every ounce of his being against what seemed to be the great doom of the alliance of men and elves. The struggle was brutal, with the men of Dorthonion unable to match the seemingly endless tide of orcs, which continued to sow death and destruction. The Edain of the House of Beor slowly died, almost to a man, which left a band of 12 men to Barahir, with which he would continue the fight. The remaining women and children fled to the forest Brethil, though their path was long and dangerous. Fortunately, however, the mountain forts of the mountain range of Ered Wethrin surrounding the region of Hithlum were able to hold. The assault upon these well-wrought and valiantly defended bastions was a horrifying sight to behold, as the garrisons barely held, in no small part due to the protections afforded by the mountains against the fires of Morgoth. The Dagor Bragollach had brought crashing down the watchful peace and the Siege of Angband. The roiling rivers of flame and hosts of misshapen, cruel orcish warriors which followed in its destructive wake had scattered the sons of Fëanor across the north. These brave warriors harnessed the ferocity and prowess of their forebear to hold the line despite near cataclysmic casualties. However, this was not the end of the catastrophic losses the Elvish people would suffer during the Fourth Great Battle of the War of the Jewels, as word had reached the High King of what had occurred. The High King of the Noldor, Fingolfin, one who stood upon the very highest echelon of the Elvish people since their coming in the wake of Fëanor's fury, was overwrought with grief and despair. The immense casualties detailed to the High King threatened to overcome him, as he believed that his people could never recover from the ruination which had been visited upon the Noldor. Yet from the depths of his desperation, Fingolfin emerged bearing a rage of such inexpressible fury that he was likened to the Valar army. The High King threw all caution to the wind. In early 456, he mounted as swift a steed as he could find, set his eye upon the darkness threatening the destruction of the Free Peoples, and rode north to meet it head-on. None dared halt his advance as his steed carried him across the once green plains of Ardgallen, now forever desolated by the malice of Morgoth, until he came to the gates of Angband. The High King dismounted, and with bravery unmatched since the very artificer of the Silmarils had drawn his final breath, challenged the Dark Lord to single combat. Fingolfin smote upon the gates of Angband and cried out his challenge for all to hear, and although Morgoth remained near the apex of his strength, he hesitated. In those days, the Dark Lord was deemed to be the mightiest of all things in this world, yet he hesitated and knew the most mortal of emotions in that brief moment. Faced with the righteous fury and incredible courage of one of the mightiest warriors ever to grace the lands of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord Morgoth knew the chilling iciness of fear that pierced his very being. Yet the challenge issued by the High King could not remain unanswered. In the depths of Angband, Morgoth arrayed himself. He donned black armor and took up his mighty warhammer Grond, the hammer of the underworld. The massive gates of Angband swung open, and the Dark Lord strode forward to meet his foe, as his servants watched on expectantly. Undeterred by the inescapable doom of Mandos, Fingolfin knew no fear and drew from its sheath the blade Ringil. According to the chronicler, Fingolfin gleamed beneath it as a star, for his mail was overlaid with silver, and his blue shield was set with crystals, and he drew his sword Ringil that glittered like ice. The duel commenced, with the combatants making a direct tilt for one another. Morgoth hefted Grond, attempting to end the conflict with a single blow, and each strike of the hammer of the underworld brought with it the fierce intensity of a lightning strike, leaving a smouldering crater where it struck the ground. Yet Fingolfin displayed the grace and poise characteristic of his people and avoided each blow. Calmly he struck Morgoth back, before nimbly avoiding yet another killing blow from Grom. 7 such strikes were landed upon the Dark Lord, with Ringil biting with an icy chill each time it struck, and it is said that the craters left by Grond were filled with the blood of the Warhammer's wielder. Despite the strength of the High King, he was just an elf, and his opponent was one of the mightiest of the Valar. Fingolfin grew weary, and his weariness was to be his downfall. On 3 separate occasions, the Dark Lord made contact with his fearsome strikes, and in each instance, the High King rose to his feet and continued the fight. None could discredit the strength of character this required, yet each time Fingolfin rose, his feet were less steady and his evasions of the hammer strike increasingly ragged. Courage alone would prove insufficient in discrediting the doom of Mandos, and on that day it was proven true that no power of the elves alone could defeat Morgoth. Fingolfin, in his weariness, became less and less aware of his surroundings, and, in a desperate attempt to evade Grond once more, stumbled into one of the craters the hammer had created. Morgoth now knew that victory was imminent, and descended into the crater. Here he placed a great armoured boot upon Fingolfin's neck. This ended the life of the High King. However, with what energy remained, Fingolfin struck out one last time with the icy blade Ringil. His last sword stroke left a brutal impression upon the heel of the Dark Lord, who had already been weakened by grasping the Silmarils and in the labours required to corrupt Arda. The elf's strike left Morgoth with a permanent limp. Having slain the High King of the Noldor, Morgoth's undeniable malice shone through in the actions which followed. He took the body and broke it, with the vile intent of feeding what had indeed been a noble challenger to his wolves. Yet this would not come to be. The King of the Eagles, Thorondor, unwilling to let such an indignity come to pass, swooped down from the skies and slashed Morgoth's face with his fierce talons. This caught the Dark Lord unawares, which allowed the King of the Eagles to reclaim the High King of the Noldor's broken body. Thorondor brought the body to a mountaintop that overlooked Gondolin's hidden city within its protective valley. Turgon, heartbroken for the death of his forebear, raised a cairn to guard over Fingolfin's remains, and Fingon, with a deep-wrenching sorrow within his heart, took upon himself the title of High King of the Noldor. The elves would never make songs celebrating the valiant battle a mere elf had waged against a being of such unquantifiable power as Morgoth, for they endured such heartbreak and despair even at the thought of his passing. Nor did the orcs ever create crude or boastful songs to jeer the loss of their foe's great High King, even though the victory belonged to their master. Morgoth, though victorious, would bear the limp and wounds inflicted upon him by Fingolfin and Thorondor until the very dying days of the War of Wrath. The aftermath of the Dagor Bragollach was a stalemate of sorts. Although Morgoth remained nominally the victor, the victory threatened to be Pyrrhic if he did not proceed cautiously. The Dark Lord's losses were significant, as the elves had already begun a successful, if measured, counter-offensive. He had underestimated the valor and strength of the elves, whose spirited resistance had not been accounted for in his plans. The actions of the Edain and their bravery, perhaps despite or maybe due to their mortality, had also prevented the complete victory Morgoth sought so desperately. As a result, he withdrew the main host of his orcish legions within the gates of Angband, and began to devise a strategy to bring the Free Peoples unnumbered tears. Among the tales of sorrow and of ruin that come down to us from the darkness of those days, there are yet some in which amid weeping there is joy, and under the shadow of death light that endures. And of these histories most fair still in the ears of the elves is the tale of Beren and Lúthien. We pick up our story in the immediate aftermath of the Dagor Bragollach, 2 years after the initial conflict had devolved into a stalemate. The Isle of Tol Sirion bore upon it the finely wrought fortress of Minas Tirith, which had resisted this initial assault under the capable stewardship of Orodreth, nephew of Finrod. Still, the island, which guarded one of the most assailable routes into Beleriand, was never far from the gaze of Morgoth. So the Dark Lord sent his most able servant, the greatest of the Maiar who turned aside from the light, Sauron, to take it. Orodreth could not withstand the assault, despite his best efforts, and withdrew from the island to Nargothrond with what forces now remained to him. What had once been a fair isle was despoiled by Sauron, and would be known as Tolin Gawhoth, a haven for his werewolves, a home to foul magic. On this Isle of the Werewolves, Sauron began to consolidate his power with his 2 mightiest servants, Drauglin, the sire and mightiest of the werewolves, and his very herald, the vampire Thoringwethil. However, in the highlands of Dothonion, the resistance of Barahir and his companions was unrelenting, despite their increasingly difficult situation. The outlaw band consisted of Barahir's son Beren, his nephews Baragund the Elder and Belegund the Younger, Rauruin, Dairuin, Dagnir, Ragnar, Arthad, Urthel, Hathaldir the Young, Gildor, and Gorlim the Unhappy. This group caused untold damage to the forces of Morgoth in the area from their base of operations in Tarn Eluin, infuriating the servants of the Dark Lord. In response, they were unrelenting in their attempts to hunt down the final remnants of this proud people. Their methods were brutal, as they effectively treated their prey as mere animals, but they were continually frustrated in each attempt to bring Barahir's band to retribution. the company continued to fight for some 5 years, killing an immense number of the orcs. Yet this could not continue indefinitely, as courage alone could not turn back the unending orcish tides that desolated their homeland. In FA 460, one of the last men of Ladros left in Dothonion, Gorlim, son of Angrim, went out to hunt while the company was camped in the south of Ladros. Before the coming of the Great Flame, this had been Gorlim's home, and while out on the hunt, he went to see the ruin of what had once been his home. He gazed through a window and was treated to a vision of his wife, Eiluned, who was supposedly dead. This vision had dire consequences for Barahir's company, as Gorlim decided to search for his wife in his heartbroken state. He came out of hiding and was soon waylaid and taken captive by orcs, who brought him in chains before the lieutenant of the Dark Lord, Sauron. The latter's cunning in those days was unmatched, and he poured honeyed words into this forlorn man of Ladros, promising that Eiluned would be returned to him. All that would be required of him was to give up the location of his friends. With a heavy heart, Gorlim agreed and revealed the position of Barahir and his companions. Yet it seemed that in these days, betrayal could only be rewarded with further betrayal. Sauron told Gorlim that the vision he had come across was naught more than a spectre that he had devised. His wife, the most precious thing Gorlim had believed to be left to him, was already dead. "Nonetheless, I will grant thy prayer," said Sauron, "and thou shalt go to Eiluned and be free of my service." And so Gorlim was executed without mercy, as Sauron turned his eyes upon one of the greatest thorns in the side of the armies of Morgoth. Sauron's forces ambushed the men of Barahir upon the Tana Luin, as they were slain to a man, except for Barahir's son, Beren. Fortunately for father and son alike, Beren had been engaged in an errand away from the camp when the orcs assaulted and brutally destroyed the company. Beren came upon the remains of his father and was stricken with grief. He knew that such a great man required a fitting burial. Yet his father's hand had been severed, and with it, the greatest heirloom of their house, the Ring of Barahir, was lost without any chance of reclamation. As Beren set himself to the task of raising a cairn for his fallen father, Gorlim appeared before him as a spectre. The traitor revealed his misdeeds and attempted to make amends. He informed Beren of what had happened to the ring, and then bid him farewell before returning hopefully to the side of his slain wife. With this information in hand, Beren would return the favour in kind for his orcish foes. He hunted down the orc band responsible for the murder of his father and friends, killing the orc chieftain Gorgol the Butcher. In doing so, he achieved what solace he could attain given the circumstances, and reclaimed his father's severed hand with the Ring of Barahir with it. In the aftermath of this successful ambush, Beren would make a life for himself as he slaughtered many of Morgoth's servants. He became a friend of the birds and animals of the forest during his 4 years in which he acted as a solitary outlaw. Beren would not hunt or kill any of these beasts, reserving his strength at arms solely for the servants of Morgoth. This son of Barahir feared not the final embrace of death, only that he would be taken captive by those he sought to receive the ever-growing price now put on his head. His position within the only land he had known as home became untenable when Sauron began to pursue him. A price had been placed upon his head by Morgoth, which was matched by the bounty placed upon the crowned head of Fingon Felagund. Beren proved so effective in his guerrilla tactics that Sauron was granted an army to track down the last of Barahir's company. He would supplement this force with werewolves, among them the greatest of their number, Draugluin, the sire of their kind, and such fell beasts that contained within their being spirits of a horrifying nature, which Sauron had bound within their bodies. Therefore, Beren was forced to flee south through the horrors of the Ered Gorgoroth and the forests of Nan Dorgotheb into Doriath, where he was able to reach the Girdle of Melian. The Ered Gorgoroth, and the Dongotheb in particular, would have caused any lesser man's imminent and brutal slaughter. In this dark and terrible place, the offspring of Ungoliant now made their home, trapping all living beings who foolishly delved too deeply into the area. These spiders were monsters of such a dark and ancient nature that they were born in the long dark before the sun's rising, and they hunted Beren silently throughout his journey. Yet he would endure and make it through relatively unscathed to Doriath, where he would meet and become instantly entranced by Lúthien. Lúthien was a princess of the Sindar and the beloved daughter of the Elvish king Thingol and the Maiar Melian. This chance meeting would begin the greatest love story in all of the great ages of Middle-earth, while simultaneously setting in motion events that would have devastating consequences for the race of elves and the Edain. Lúthien, also called Tinuviel, the Nightingale by Beren, was known as the most beautiful of all the children of Ilúvatar, embodying the grace and perfection most characteristic of the elvish peoples in their heyday. She was the only daughter of one of the greatest elvish kings in all Beleriand, and a being of immense power due to her mother being of the Maiar, so it came as a shock to everyone that she fell in love with an Edain outlaw who had nothing more to his name than his courage and strength at arms. The news garnered a particularly frosty reception from Thingol, who tacitly accepted their betrothal should Beren meet the bride price. This price, however, was one even a man of Beren's stature and courage could not possibly hope to attain, as Thingol wished to receive a Silmaril from Morgoth's Iron Crown in return for his daughter's hand. Beren had once known anguish and despair, yet Lúthien provided the salve for such woe, and even faced with the impossible, Beren would not allow the darkness of his fate to overwhelm him so long as the chance of a life with Lúthien lay before him. For little price, he said, do elven kings sell their daughters, for gems and things made by craft. But if this be your will, Thingol, I will perform it. And when we meet again I shall hold a Silmaril from the Iron Crown, for you have not looked upon the last of Beren, son of Barahir. With this talk of defiance, the quest of the Silmaril began, and Beren immediately made haste to Nargothrond. Here he asked for the counsel of Finrod Felagund, the elf who owed his very life to Beren's forebear Barahir. Felagund knew that such oaths as the one he had sworn on that bloody day could not be set aside so quickly, and as such, he passed to his brother Orodreth the crown of Nargothrond. The sons of Fëanor, who dwelled within his kingdom, Celeform and Curufin, watched proceedings keenly, as Finrod, Beren and 10 loyal companions set out along the Narok, and travelled to its very source within the Falls of Irvin. There they came upon and slaughtered a band of orcs. Afterward, Finrod utilised all of his craft to disguise the company as the now deceased orcs, to potentially pass through the Tolin-Gauhoth without being detected. Yet the cunning of Sauron was too great. Having had his suspicion aroused by their conduct, the greatest servant of the Dark Lord stripped the companions of their disguises and took them prisoner, following a long and protracted duel with Finrod through song. In the deepest pit of the fortress, Sauron sent his werewolves to devour the brave companions of Finrod one by one to ensure they divulged the purpose of their quest. Yet they remained loyal. Before long, the only 2 survivors were Beren and Finrod. When the time came for Beren to be eaten, Finrod Felagund, unwilling to let the son of the man who had saved his life be murdered before his very eyes, attacked the werewolf with his bare hands. The struggle was fierce, with the unarmed Finrod eventually striking down his foe, though at a high cost, as he was mortally wounded in the encounter. In the deepest, darkest pit of the very fortress he had once constructed, one of the wisest and most beloved of the Noldor's life ended, but he kept his oath with his final breath. Hope had just been extinguished for the son of Barahir, yet upon his capture, Lúthien had felt a crushing weight upon her heart and set out in pursuit of her great love. Unfortunately, she met Noldorin princes Celegorm and Curufin alongside their hound Huan. The princes offered their help, but Celegorm fell in love with the princess, captured her, and took her to Nargothrond. Yet the great hound Huan had become entranced by the elf and spoke aloud for the first time. He granted her his counsel and helped her to escape. They made with great haste to Tolin-Gauhoth, arriving at the hour of Felagund's death. This arrival drew a cruel smile to the lips of Sauron, who foresaw the great reward he would receive for Lúthien's capture. Morgoth would look upon his servant with great favour if he were to bring such a prize. Beren's quest now hung upon a knife's edge, with no more than the hound of the Valar Huan standing in Sauron's way. In order to capture Lúthien, Sauron sent all of his werewolves, including their great sire Draugluin. Yet Huan would not yield before them. The great hound of the Valar gave not an inch and slaughtered each and every assailant who came to take the woman he so deeply adored. Sauron watched on as his servants were brought low by the hound, and knew that the situation would require his own intervention. The future Dark Lord took the form of a great and formidable wolf as he engaged Huan in combat. Yet even he could not defeat the Hound of the Valar, and was forced to yield the island. This left Tolin Gawhoth in the hands of Lúthien, who cleared the taint of the land and freed Beren. The pair then buried Finrod and left the island behind them. Unfortunately, now that the danger had seemingly dissipated, the ever-loyal Huan had to return to his master Celegorm, depriving them of a formidable ally in the struggle to come. Yet his loyalty was to be tested, as Celegorm and Curufin crossed paths with Beren and Lúthien near the forest of Brethil. They aimed to kill Beren and take Lúthien captive. However, Huan was unwilling to allow such a foul act to be committed. Beren then took from Curufin his horse and knife, Angrist, and gave him permission to return to his people humbled. Yet the malice of Curufin remained, and he took from his brother his bow and fired upon Lúthien, forcing Beren to dive before the arrow. Beren was wounded and was about to be killed, but Huan drove off the brothers. He also brought with him a herb that Lúthien used to save the life of her love. Following that, they returned to Doriath. In Doriath, Beren entrusted the life of Lúthien to the guardianship of Huan, as he knew he had to return to the north to finish his quest of taking the Silmarils from the Dark Lord Morgoth. He now believed this would be his final act, and as such, he sang the farewell song of parting, yet aid came unbidden as Huan and Lúthien returned to his side. Huan spoke for only the second time, stating that Beren would no longer be able to save Lúthien from her fate. From the shadow of death you can no longer save Lúthien, for by her love she is now subject to it. So he allowed her to accompany him further as they took upon themselves the guise of Draugluin and the bat-like messenger of Sauron, known as Thringwithil, to pass through the Anfalglith without being accosted. As the pair reached the very gates of Angband, weary beyond belief, a previously unknown threat lay before them. Following the retreat of the elves from the Ardgullen, a venomous new warden had been placed before the fortress, a wolf of immense proportions, Carcharoth, also called the Red Maw, who had already heard news of Draugluin's demise, and hence was suspicious of the pair. Yet Lúthien, through her magic, was able to command the wolf to sleep, and the duo was able to descend to the very depths of Angband, before coming face to face with the Dark Lord in his throne room. This hall, patrolled by Balrogs, was filled with horrors never witnessed before by the eyes of the Free Peoples, and the very strength of the gaze of Morgoth robbed Lúthien of her disguise. Yet Lúthien's courage shone through once more, as she was undaunted by the vile horrors which she now faced, and instead of cowering beneath the weight of her doom, she offered to sing for the Dark Lord. As she evaded his sight, she began to sing a piece of such unimaginable beauty and blinding power that Morgoth was forced to dream of the void, and alongside the rest of his court, fell into a deep, darkened slumber. Beren recognized what must be done, and put aside his disguise, taking from its sheath the blade of the son of Fëanor, Angrist, and taking from Morgoth's crown a Silmaril. Yet this mere man deigned that if he could garner a single Silmaril, he could bring with him all three. His very blade was to betray him, however. Angrist snapped with a sharp fragment of the finely wrought blade striking the cheek of the Dark Lord, which caused him to arouse and awaken the legions of Angband from their slumber. The gravity of their situation became clear to Beren and Lúthien immediately, which caused them to flee with all haste to the surface. Yet they had merely left the frying pan and emerged instantly into the flame, as Carcharoth, who was created to take on the Hound of the Valar Huan, was now awake and furious at the deception of Lúthien. Beren attempted to drive him off using the light of the Silmaril, which momentarily tempered his rage with a sliver of fear. Yet this was not to last, as the blackened spirit of the beast drove him once more into a rage. Carcharoth grasped the right hand of Beren within his great maw, severing it and consuming the Silmaril. This seared the innards of the mighty wolf, and he fled south, emitting such howls of madness as to drive fear into the heart of any of the free peoples he was to encounter. According to our chronicler, so terrible did he become in his madness that all the creatures of Morgoth that abode in that valley fled far away, for he slew all living things that stood in his path, and burst from the north with ruin upon the world. Carcharoth was designed as such a beast of chaos and ruin that his very fangs were laced with a potent and fatal venom, which left Beren mortally wounded. The quest, it seemed, was to end in heartbreak and despair. Yet unbidden came Thorondor with his eagles, and from the blackened skies of the Anfalglith they saved the duo from the grasps of the legions of Angband. They bore Beren and Lúthien south, passing above the glimmering jewel of the hidden city of Gondolin. Yet even this heartening sight could not assuage Lúthien's despair for the imminent passing of the great love of her life. The eagles left the pair in the glade where they had first met in Doriath, and Huan came once more to their side. There they tended the son of Barahir as he lay racked by dreams of such pain and anguish that a lesser man would have been taken by them. But as the despair of Lúthien reached its apex, the eyes of Beren fluttered open and he unexpectedly awoke. The name Erchemion, which meant the one-handed in Sindarin, was bestowed upon the most valorous of men. There they dwelt for a time in such happiness and joy, yet Beren could not set aside his oath to Thingol, and he returned Lúthien to his father. News of their return had spread far and wide in the interim, so therefore, upon their arrival in Menegroth, they had garnered a sizable welcome. They recounted the tales of adversity and woe which had befallen them since they had initially departed. Astonished by the perseverance and strength a mere man had displayed in the face of an impossible task, Thingol softened in his attitude towards the son of Barahir. Now he held it in his thoughts that no power of elf or man, Maiar, Valar, or any other such being upon the face of Arda could stand between the fate of his daughter and this man of Dorthonion. Before the very throne of her father, Beren took the hand of Lúthien, and all seemed to be well for a time, yet their peace and joy were not to last. For from the north came the howling Carcharoth, the Red Maw, as he devastated the lands he made his way through. As he was empowered by the Silmaril of Fëanor, even the girdle of Melian could not prevent his entry into Doriath. A party was assembled to confront the foul beast, before he brought ruin and devastation upon the land that Thingol, as king, had sworn to defend. The company consisted of Huan, captain of the March Warden Rangers, Mablung, chief of March Warden Rangers, Beleg Strongbow, Beren Erchemion, and Thingol himself. As they rode out to meet with a being of such immense power that the outcome of any encounter remained firmly upon a knife's edge, a great darkness fell upon the heart of Lúthien, who now saw all colour, beauty and life drained from the world. Near the northern waterfalls of Escalduin, the party met with the great wolf. Carcharoth launched his immense frame upon the king, yet Beren placed himself between Thingol and the taker of his right hand. In doing so, he saved the king of Doriath's life, but was mortally wounded himself. The great wolf was eventually slain by Huan. However, the great hound of the Valar gave his own life in the process, bidding a fond farewell to his dear friend Beren. Following this morose parting, Mablung ripped open the stomach of the wolf and took from Carcharoth the Silmaril, placing it in the one remaining hand of the son of Barahir. Beren turned to look Thingol in the eye and bade him take from him the Silmaril. The king eventually acquiesced, and Beren uttered his last words. Now the quest is achieved, and my doom full wrought. The survivors of the party brought his body back to Menegroth, and Lúthien came forth to meet the company. She now felt grief unequalled, and asked of her love to wait for her beyond the Western Sea, and despite his dire condition, his eyes fluttered open once more so that he could look upon her one last time. With his death, the quest for the Silmaril was at an end, yet the tale of Beren and Lúthien was yet to reach its final conclusion. Beren's spirit lingered within the Hall of Mandos, in the hopes that he may one day yet see Lúthien upon the dimmest shores of the outer sea, so that he could bestow upon her one final farewell. From those shores the spirits of all men were to depart the world never to return, as was the necessity of the gift of Ilúvatar. Heartbroken beyond all belief, the very spirit of Lúthien left her body and made its way to the halls of Mandos, where she knelt before the Valar themselves and sang a song of such woe and sorrow so as to move even Mandos to pity. Yet even with the power afforded to him, Mandos could not alter the fates of the children of Ilúvatar, so he turned to Manwë, who further sought the counsel of Ilúvatar, so moved was he by the plight of Beren and Lúthien. This counsel allowed two choices to Lúthien. For her valour, the extraordinary nature of the labours she had achieved throughout her lifetime, and the grief she had been forced to bear throughout, she could be permitted to stay in Valinor. There, all of her pain and sorrow, which she had endured throughout her life, would be forgotten. There was one important caveat for this option, however: Beren could not follow her along such a path. The second option would be a return to Middle-earth with Beren, where she would live out a mortal life with no guarantee of joy. They would both be subject to a second death following the end of their mortal lives. Despite this, she chose to face such a second brush with death for the sake of Beren. In doing so, she forsook the Undying Lands, and so it came to be that Lúthien Tineville and Beren Echemion would live out a mortal life together as the fairest of the elves forsook her gift of immortality for the love of a man. Soon after this exceptional decision on Lúthien's part, which had been taken in the aftermath of the return of a Silmaril, word reached Maedhros of their quest. In an act that none of the sons of Fëanor had up until this point been able to replicate, Maedhros had become convinced that Morgoth was far from the invincible foe they had once imagined him to be. This brought hope to the fiercest of the sons of Fëanor, who now believed it possible to end for good and all the domination of Morgoth. This alliance of the great houses of the Elves and Edain would come to be known as the Union of Maedhros. In the Dagor Bragollach, the sudden onslaught of Morgoth had caused the loss of the entirety of the north of Beleriand. The new line in the sand, some 20 years after the defeat of the Free Peoples, consisted of the fortified strongholds of Nargothrond, Hithlum and Himring. This line was further substantiated by Gondolin, which still lay hidden within its veil, unable to be assaulted or even located by the forces of the Dark Lord. While the Dagor Bragollach had inflicted crushing casualties upon the elves and their allies, a strength that Maedhros yet hoped to harness remained. In the year 468 of the First Age, Maedhros was able to bring his cause to elves, men and dwarves, able to set aside the deserved reputation of the Sons of Fëanor for division. The dwarves of the Blue Mountains supplied the armies of the Union, as well as forging brutal instruments of war. The preparations of Maedhros and his alliance even led to word reaching the hidden city of Gondolin. Here, Turgon began to make his own arrangements, as despite the city's hidden nature, he didn't want the union of Maedhros to stand against the might of Morgoth alone. Yet the wounds inflicted by Maedhros's brothers and his father, Fëanor, were not so easily forgotten. Orodreth refused to lend his aid to the Union due to the evil wrought by Celegorm and Curufin, which inadvertently caused the death of Finrod, which had poisoned the ruler of Nargothrond against the Sons of Fëanor. Likewise, Thingol had sworn an oath in which he would never take up arms alongside the Sons of Fëanor again. His disdain was further enforced by the arrogant demands of Fëanor's sons to give them the Silmaril retrieved by Beren and Lúthien. Although Melian had counselled Thingol to surrender the jewel, he had begun to covet the Silmaril and refused. In response, Celegorm and Curufin promised to destroy Doriath should they be successful in the battle against Morgoth, forcing Thingol to strengthen his border defences to ensure the brothers' wrath was not visited upon his lands. Therefore, only a token force came to the aid of the Union from the realms of Doriath and Nargothrond. Against the command of Orodreth, from Nargothrond came a minor company with Gwyndor at its head, who joined the Union in the hopes of avenging the capture of Gelmir during the Dagor Bragollach. Only the March Wardens, Mablung and Beleg, made their way from the girdle to join in the supposed great deeds which now lay ahead. In the absence of a true uniting force in the now deceased Fingolfin, the elves were fractured. Undeterred, Maedhros set his mind to the task at hand. An able tactician, he used all that was left at his disposal and invited the newly arrived Easterlings to join his force. The head of the Union divided the strength available to him into two separate forces to attack Angband. Maedhros was to lead his slightly larger army to the dusty plains of Anfalglith, and in doing so, he would draw out the true force of Morgoth's host. He would then engage them on the once grassy knolls of that plain, and this would then allow Fingon's hidden army to emerge from the Ered Wethrin and flank the Dark Lord's hordes, utterly routing them. Maedhros took command of the force in the east, bringing with him all his brothers to act as his lieutenants in the battle to come. The eastern army was composed of the formidable, heavily armed and armoured dwarves of Novgorod and Belegost, Maedhros' elves and Bor's men of the Himring, and the men of Amon-Ereb, commanded by Caranthir and Ulfang. The western host, commanded by Fingon, also included men and elves of Hithlum, elves of the Falas, the minor contingents of Nargothrond, Beleg and Mablung of Doriath, and the Haladin of Brethil. Maedhros believed that with the force he had amassed, the very gates of Angband could be sealed shut, ensuring that Morgoth would be permanently driven underground, never to re-emerge and make war upon Elf or Edain again. The Union began its move north with clinical efficiency. The combined forces easily cleared the orc bands who had terrorized Beleriand and Dothonion, before reaching a suitable area for a final muster. While this seemed to be a victory for the Union, the hasty retreat of the orcs before the formidable alliance alerted Morgoth to their intent, and he drew to him his most trusted lieutenants to provide him with counsel against what was to come. Maedhros had shown his hand too early, prior to full mobilization, and this would prove detrimental. Further spies within the combined forces of the Free Peoples could also be found within the Easterlings. Chief among them, in a grand conspiracy to derail Maedhros, was Ulfang and his companions. These traitors were to provide the information necessary for Morgoth to array his armies in such a way as to counter Maedhros' well-laid plans in short order. As a result, a gargantuan host, with Glaurung and his brood at its head, was sent to attack Maedhros' host, and Fingon's army remained unaware of this counter-maneuver. As Fingon arrived to the designated point of the Ered Wethrin, smoke and flame began to pour forth from Thangorodrim and the Iron Mountains. This caused the heart of every elf and man gathered there to sink, as they became aware that the Dark Lord had uncovered their plans, and in doing so, obtained the upper hand. As doubt began to fester within the ranks of Fingon's host, hope once more came unbidden from the south, as Turgon came to the aid of the Union, bringing with him some 10,000 warriors of Gondolin. The hopes of the Union were once more rekindled, yet even as the battle hung in the balance, the doom of Mandos would yet bear down upon all who fought against the overpowering darkness. Morgoth was aware of the locations of both armies, and the method in which Maedhros hoped to use Fingon's host as a hammer against his anvil. In order to draw them out, Morgoth sent a massive army of orcs to taunt them down from the hills. Yet even this force was but a mere fraction of what he could bring to bear, and as such would act as a mere decoy. Fingon was a wise commander, however, and refused to give in to the taunts of the orcs, instead keeping his forces hidden, as Maedhros had ordered. Yet disaster was to strike the Western army, as the leader of the Orcish army sent forth a group of riders to parley with the elves. Among their number was Gelmir, brother of Gwyndor, who had been tortured and blinded by the Dark Lord's servants. This enraged Gwyndor and the host from Nargothrond, yet what was to come would drive them into a fury. To draw out the elvish host, the riders began to dismember Gelmir, with Gwyndor and his company in the front line able to witness the entire torrid affair. Driven mad by the cruel and brutal death inflicted upon his brother, Gwyndor broke formation and charged wildly into the Orcish lines, accompanied by the warriors of Nargothrond. Their fury was so intense that the vastly outnumbered elves cut a bloody swath through the Orcish centre, but they did not stop there, as their momentum drove them ever onwards. Fingon at this point recognised that the fury of Gwyndor had begun to seep into the remainder of his host, and knew that restraining them was a fool's errand. The leader of the western host sounded the charge, and the entire force was committed to the fray. The swiftness of Fingon's decision negated Morgoth's cunning, as the charge was so brutal in its haste that the entire Orcish army was annihilated before the Dark Lord could send sufficient reinforcements. Gwyndor's fury ensured that the charge would continue right to the very gates of Angband, where the guard was slaughtered by his company, and they strode through the very outer gates of the fortress. Within the depths of Angband, upon his throne, Morgoth, the most powerful being in all of Middle-earth, once more knew fear, as he visibly trembled while Gwyndor and his company pounded upon his gates. Ever in the forefront of the battle went Gwyndor and the Elves of Nargothrond, and even now they could not be restrained, and they burst through the gate and slew the guards upon the very stairs of Angband, and Morgoth trembled upon his deep throne, hearing them beat upon his doors. Yet they were quickly surrounded by a swirling tide of foes, who trapped them within the courtyard. All were slain bar Gwyndor, who was taken as a captive. Fingon valiantly attempted to reach them, but it was in vain, and his efforts left the host brutally exposed. When Morgoth released his true strength from many secret doors throughout Thangorodrim, the attempt of the Elvish army to save Gwyndor was to cost them dearly. Fingon was forced to retreat from Angband's walls, with immense casualties being wrought upon his troops. In particular, the rearguard, composed of the men of Brethil, was destroyed almost to a man, and among the fallen was the Lord of the Haladin, Haldir. While this initial encounter was a brutal setback for the Free Peoples, it was the fourth day of the battle in which the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, or Battle of Unnumbered Tears, began. Fingon's forces had continued to retreat, yet casualties were likewise mounting. However, early on the fourth day, this host was reinforced by Turgon's 10,000, who had refused to join the reckless charge earlier in the conflict. The Gondolin phalanx brought the Orcish advance to a stuttering halt, as it broke through their lines, allowing them to meet with Fingon's personal guard, among them the son of Galdor, Hurin. With the aid of the warriors of the Hidden Vale, the army of Angband was driven back long enough to allow an unmolested retreat to ensue. While the western host may have earned a brief respite, the eastern host would enjoy no such thing. Maedhros had been utterly defeated by the innumerable hordes of Morgoth, combined with treacherous Easterlings led by Ulfang the Black. Ulfang and his sons were to lose their lives in the ensuing battle. However, the damage had already been done at this point, and the combined treachery, in conjunction with the brutal flames of the dragons, would have led to the complete destruction of the host if not for the dwarves. The denizens of Belegost, who were naturally resistant to heat and fire, while also being clad in iron masks providing extra protection, made up the rearguard of the host. Their king, Azagul, recognized that if they did not intervene, Glaurung would continue to wreak untold havoc upon the surviving Elves and Edain. He therefore took decisive action, and with his warriors formed a ring around Glaurung, buying precious time for their brothers-in-arms to escape. Their weapons were so finely wrought, and wielded with such strength and valour by the dwarves of Belegost, that not even the armoured hide of Glaurung was impervious to their axe strikes. Infuriated by the unending hail of blows that continued to rain down upon him, the great dragon brought low Azagul and crawled over him with his mighty frame. The king of the dwarves remained an unyielding opponent even in his final moments, however, and with the last ounce of strength available to him, he ran the master-crafted dagger, which he had kept at his side throughout the battle, across the stomach of the mighty beast. This caused Glaurung to let out a long and loud cry of pain, and flee the field in agony, as he brought with him all the beasts of Morgoth, who had been harrying the fleeing Elves and Edain up until this point. The dwarves, heartbroken at the loss of their beloved king, picked up his broken body and carried it upon their stout shoulders in a solemn procession as they marched the entire way home. The fury and ferocity of the dwarves were unmatched, and no servant of the Dark Lord was willing to impede their progress. The sacrifice of the dwarves on that day saved all 7 of the sons of Fëanor through their rearguard action, even though their host was now scattered throughout Osiriand and all hope of victory had now passed before them, as neither Elf nor Edain could overcome the doom which now lay before them. With Maedhros and the sons of Fëanor utterly routed in the east, Morgoth's forces who had engaged them now made their way with the utmost swiftness to engage the remaining forces of Fingon. They would arrive just as the elves had begun to withdraw, and in order to prevent any form of orderly retreat, they engaged them immediately. The elves fought valiantly, yet the very herald of their destruction, Gothmog, soon arrived upon the field of battle, accompanied by his troll guard. In an attempt to bring a hasty end to any form of an organized defense of the elvish position, Gothmog immediately engaged Fingon in single combat. The battle-hardened elf proved to be a match even for the High Captain of Angband and Slayer of Fëanor, matching him blow for blow and refusing to yield even an inch against such a formidable foe. Unfortunately for the western host, the Balrogs knew nothing of honor, and another of Gothmog's company restrained the noble elf from behind with his flaming whip. Gothmog then approached the leader of the remaining army of the Free Peoples, and with his black axe split Fingon's skull in twain, and with his passing, the valiant resistance of Elf and Edain deteriorated into an utterly lost cause. It is at this point that Húrin saw that the field was lost, and urged Turgon to flee with all haste to Gondolin, for as long as the hidden city remained, Morgoth's victory could not be complete. He gave his vow to cover their retreat, essentially offering to sacrifice his life, so that a hope, no matter how dismal it may seem, would persist. The king agreed with a heavy heart and made his withdrawal, as Húr, Húrin, and those men of Dor Lomin who had survived the onslaught so far erected a living wall of spear and shield across the fens of Serech. This noble sacrifice on their part allowed the battered and broken remnants of the elvish contingent to make it back to the Valley of Gondolin without giving away its location. The men of Dor Lomin sold their lives dearly in the dying embers of the War of the Jewels, with the field littered with orcish bodies as the rearguard's numbers dwindled until none except Húrin remained to continue the fight. With the oath to fight to the last to protect Turgon and his people at the forefront of his mind, Húrin fought on alone. With his sword and spear now lost to him, he hefted a great axe that belonged to a slain orcish captain, and brought low 70 of the enemy's number with this crude weapon. Every time the blade rose and made a sickening impact upon the unending tide of the great enemy, a mighty cry would usher from Húrin's lips, "Ori into Luva, day shall come again." 70 times was the stirring call heard upon that black day, yet even this formidable scion of a warrior dynasty could not stay the coming of the night and the terrors which were soon to be loosed upon all he held dear. Among this group were a great number of the troll guard of Morgoth, whose caustic blood caused the axe to be destroyed as it simply began to fade away in Húrin's hands. This would prove to be the end of the final ounce of resistance in northern Beleriand. As he was left effectively unarmed, Gothmog captured the last of the rearguard of Dor Lomin and brought him in chains to Angband. Following on from the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and the shedding of the Unnumbered Tears by Elf, Edain and Dwarf in equal measure, Morgoth had effectively achieved as complete a victory as he could have imagined. The power of the Free Peoples to engage him in open combat was utterly broken. All of the people of Hithlum had been destroyed, and the sons of Fëanor scattered. All Beleriand bar Doriath, still within the protection of the Girdle of Melian, had been razed by the orcish rabble, and the havens of the Falas had also been sacked. Morgoth paid little heed to the surviving kingdoms of Nargothrond and Doriath, for he knew that they posed little threat to him now in their diminished states. Morgoth further displayed his cruel guile by betraying his Easterling allies as he trapped them in Hithlum under penalty of death, which deprived them of the newly won fertile lands of Beleriand. Yet the victory was not entirely complete due to the time won by the living wall of the Dor Lomin, as the newly crowned High King of the Noldor, Turgon, and his city, Gondolin, remained hidden from the gaze of the Dark Lord. In the hopes of discovering its location, Húrin was brought to the Dark Lord, yet he would not reveal the city's location and instead mocked Morgoth, insisting he would never betray Turgon. In response, a curse of titanically terrible proportions was laid upon Húrin and his kin, with the valorous man of Dolomin bound to a chair upon Thangorodrim, where he would be forced to watch the brutal tale unfold before his very eyes. Now sit there, and look out upon the lands where evil and despair shall come upon those whom you lovest. Thou hast dared to mock me, and to question the power of Melkor, master of the fates of Arda. Therefore with my eyes thou shalt see, and with my ears shalt hear, and never shalt thou move from this place until all is fulfilled unto its bitter end. Following on from the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, the free peoples of Middle-earth reached their lowest ebb since the coming of Fëanor and the Noldor to the shores of the continent. The great victories and hard-won equilibrium which had been established in the intervening years had all been for naught, as the doom of Mandos still hung upon the free peoples, removing any chance of overcoming the impending darkness which spread from the gates of Angband with a slow, unceasing certainty which none amongst the free peoples could halt. Yet even at this point in Tolkien's mythos, whereupon the night was at its darkest, the efforts of those who had come before, who had so freely given their lives in the service of a greater cause than themselves, were not in vain. For as long as the slightest sparking ember of hope remained to those who persisted, the future would remain far from set. It is through the lens of cruel beauty that the First Age of Middle-earth and the War of the Jewels cement themselves as the bedrock upon which the fantasy genre now rests, and such is to be J.R.R. Tolkien's great legacy. The next few videos in this series will conclude our tale with the War of Wrath and the coming of the Valar, but we're planning to cover the battles of many other fantasy, sci-fi and space opera universes, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Please consider liking and sharing as it helps immensely, and don't forget to comment. We will try to read and respond to every comment as we want to know what you think about this video and which videos you hope to see in the future. This is the Wizards and Warriors channel, and we'll catch you on the next one.